This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Koufax pitched his fourth no-hit game on September 9, 1965, beating the Chicago Cubs 1-0 and establishing himself, at the time, as the all-time leader. His 4 no-hitters now stand in second place behind Nolan Ryan's 7. The box score of that game records perfection itself. 27 at-bats, 3 columns of zeros. But it wasn't quite that easy for Koufax. And reading a more detailed account of the action, you understand how and when Dame Fortune rose from her chair to play a hand in the game. Twice in the first 2 innings, for example, batters hit Koufax's pitches hard, but came up empty. One was a line drive down the third baseline that twisted foul by less than the width of the ball. Another in the second inning, another line drive was caught by the center fielder, Willie Davis, who happened to catch the ball only because he was once again, habitually and incautiously, playing a shallow center field. Meanwhile, in celebrating Koufax's achievement, it's easy to overlook the equally fine pitching, or almost equally fine pitching, of the Cubs' Bob Hendley, who took his own no-hitter into the 7th inning, when, with 2 out, Lou Johnson of the Dodgers swung late and hit what one player called a duck fart down the right field line. The ball floated slowly over the heads of both the first and second basemen, landed and rolled dead only a few inches inside the foul line. If Johnson had guided the ball robotically, he could not have placed it more precisely between the 3 frantically converging Cubs. Such goofballs are every pitcher's nightmare. You have good stuff, you get way ahead of the guy, 0-2 or 1-2, and then you go for the strikeout with a slider or fastball just off the plate. He's completely fooled by the pitch. He sticks his bat out in desperation. It's accidental, comical actually, how bad his swing looks. It's not really even a swing. The ball catches the bat way beyond the label, down at the tip where there's absolutely zero mass and power. It's impossible to hit a ball fair and hit it more poorly. Yet by some ugly miracle, the ball gets lifted casually, almost cruelly, into the no-man's land between infielders and outfielders. So Koufax gets hit hard a couple of times and gets the win, and the no-hitter, while Hendley gets tagged for a couple of cheap shots and takes the loss. The career of Koufax illustrates how hard it is to come up with a measure of pitchers' true effectiveness. Koufax pitched for the Dodgers for 12 years, first in Brooklyn, later in Los Angeles. By conventional measures of wins and losses and ERA, Koufax's career falls neatly into 2 halves. There were the first mediocre 6 years. He had a 1-loss record of 36-40, an ERA of 4.04. They were followed by 6 years of absolute brilliance, during which time Koufax pitched arguably better than any other pitcher ever. 1-loss record, 129-47, ERA of 2.24. The contrast between the 2 halves of Koufax's total years on the mound couldn't be more striking. He seems somehow to have been reborn. By the way, just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, ERA stands for Earned Run Average, and it's the most common metric used to determine a pitcher's effectiveness and to make comparisons between 2 or more of them. An earned run is one scored by a combination of hits or hits and walks, that is, runs for which the pitcher is directly responsible. It doesn't include runs scored because of errors. The formula used to calculate a pitcher's ERA is simple. First, divide the sum of all the runs scored during all the innings a pitcher is on the mound. Divide that number by the total number of innings pitched. This figure, hopefully it's a fraction, represents the number of runs scored against the pitcher on average each inning. Then multiply that fraction by 9 to arrive at the average number of runs the pitcher would give up over the course of an entire game. An ERA between 3 and 5 is considered respectable, though anything above 4.5 is borderline. Less than 3 is exceptional, and those pitchers who have maintained an ERA below 3 for the majority of their careers are likely to be in the Hall of Fame. But look at Koufax's WHIP, or WHIP, numbers. To calculate a player's WHIP, you take walks plus hits, divide them by innings pitched. These tell a slightly more complete story. The same broad pattern of early struggle and subsequent triumph is still there. From 1955 through 1960, Koufax's whip ranged from about 1.3 to 1.7, while from 1961 until he retired in 1966, it lay between 0.9 and 1.2. But measured in this way, the separation between the two periods isn't quite as great. In other words, what looks by conventional metrics like nothing short of metamorphosis turns out to be a simpler story of toil and sweat. As early as his third year with the Dodgers, Koufax was nearly as effective at getting batters out as he ever would be. The greatest difference between the early years and the later ones is in the ratio of walks to strikeouts. As soon as Koufax began striking out batters at the rate of about one each inning, he ripped a hole in opponents' offensive possibilities. In the last 6 years of his career, Sandy Koufax simply became the pitcher he had been all along. Finally, to get some perspective on Koufax's achievements, compare his stats to those of his teammate Don Drysdale. In 14 seasons, all with the Dodgers, Drysdale pitched 3,432 innings, giving up a combined 3,939 hits and bases on balls. His career ERA was 2.95. Koufax's was 2.76. And his career whip was 1.15. Koufax's 1.11. So Koufax was the better pitcher, but not by much. Both are in the Hall of Fame. One more pitching metric: hits versus strikeouts. If as a pitcher at any level of the game, over the course of your career, you give up an average of 1 hit per inning and also strike out 1 batter per inning, you'll end up doing great. See, there's nothing to it. A little bit about sports medicine. Every pitching arm is doomed, writes Jane Levy, and Sandy Koufax was only 30 years old in April 1966, at the height of his powers, when the team doctor told him it would be his last season before permanent injury to his arm. Modern medicine wasn't ready to help a baseball pitcher when he needed it back then. Koufax had bone spurs in his elbow and took cortisone shots continuously just to endure the pain and to get through a year. Today, those are conditions that could be fixed. Doctors could have performed arthroscopic surgery on the elbow, common procedure now. Koufax could have had the operation over the winter and have been back in action the following season. A tougher problem for pitchers involves the rotator cuff, 4 muscles that can be torn away from the bone of the upper arm. Before modern surgical techniques, many pitchers had their careers ended with this injury. Don Drysdale, Ron Perranoski, Wayne Garland, Steve Busby, Don Gullett, Jim Bibby, all of them. Drysdale masked the pain with medication instead of getting treatment early. He was sometimes so doped up, he said, he couldn't even read the scoreboard. Not until Roberto Clemente almost killed him with a batted ball did Drysdale decide to get help, but by then it was too late. The best-known pitcher with an arm injury is Tommy John. John had a 13-3 record in July 1974 and seemed headed for 20 victories and the Cy Young Award when the pain in his arm from a torn ligament drove him to consult Dr. Frank Jobe, who had operated successfully on basketball stars like Wilt Chamberlain, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor. Jobe removed a ligament from John's right arm and reconstructed it around his left pitching elbow. There followed a year of rehabilitation, ice packs alternating with almost scalding hot water, ultrasound, and massages. Here's a summary of Tommy John's post-surgery baseball career by the baseball historian John Thorne. Thorne writes, "After a year out of the game, John came back to win 10 and lose 10 in 1976. The next year he was 20-7. In all, John pitched through 1987, 12 years after coming off the operating table, and won 153 games, more than he had won in the 12 years before his operation. In fact, he was a better pitcher with his new arm, going 124-106 before the surgery and 153-110 afterward." Thorne goes on, though, to ask another kind of question about athletics who need surgery. Helpful though it may be, Thorne says, one has to question the ethics of surgery and the ethics of pitching to the point of needing surgery. Any activity that requires a human being deliberately to abuse a valuable part of his body is essentially immoral. Thorne goes on. What is the difference, he asks? What's the difference between surgery to regain a competitive edge and the use of steroids to give an Olympic weightlifter an edge? Both give the user an unfair advantage. Both are unnatural and harmful to the body. I've thought about that question every time I teach baseball, and I still haven't come up with a good answer to it. It reminds me of those trick pictures that you can see in two completely different ways. Both are right, both are wrong, and neither one is better. What do you think? Word about relief pitchers. Starting pitchers may brood now and then over the messes they sometimes create, but their psyches are on the whole relatively sunny. They know that the next time they step on the mound, they start clean. In contrast, the inner life of a relief pitcher is full of demons and self-inflicted tortures, as distressing to the soul as any of the outer circles of Dante's hell. The role of relief pitchers, haunted permanently by a single mistake, is long. In the 8th inning of Game 4 of the 1996 World Series, the Braves' Mark Wohlers gave up a 3-run home run to the Yankees' Jim Leyritz, tying the score. Leyritz's homer turned the series around, and the Yankees went on to take that game in extra innings, as well as the next 2 for the championship. Wohlers struggled for years afterwards to regain his control, though it would be more accurate to say he struggled in vain to regain his confidence. Mitch Williams of the Phillies gave up a 3-run home run to Toronto's Joe Carter to give the Blue Jays the 1993 World Series. Thereafter, Williams, who had been credited with a total of 45 saves in the 1993 season, including 2 in the National League playoffs. Thereafter, he managed only 6 saves in the next 3 years, at which point he retired. But probably the most widely known of all baseball's blown saves occurred on the last game of the 1951 season, when Ralph Branca of the Dodgers gave up a 9th-inning home run to the New York Giants' Bobby Thompson. Thompson's so-called shot heard round the world gave the Giants the pennant. And for years afterwards, Branca, a devout Catholic, sought to console himself with the idea that God loved him so much that he chose him alone to bear the loss, because he knew that his strong faith would sustain him. Years later, Branca learned to his surprise that his mother had in fact been Jewish, not Catholic. At that point, he began to wonder if God had instead chosen him to be a modern-day Job. Neither possibility offered him much by way of consolation. Seeing your life in terms of Job's tears or a martyr's sacrifice is not likely to produce a generally upbeat disposition. At the time he threw that pitch, Branca was a strong, healthy 25-year-old pitcher. The next year, he injured his arm, effectively ending his career. He won a total of just 12 games with 3 different clubs over the next 5 years, and in 1956 he retired. Near the top of this sad litany of broken-down relief pitchers, there's Donnie Moore, whose tale is as cautionary as it's tragic. Moore was a relief pitcher for the California Angels, gave up a home run in relief in Game 5 of the 1986 American League playoffs. In the 9th inning, with the Angels leading 5-4 and 1 strike away from the World Series, Moore threw a forkball that Boston's Dave Henderson hit over the wall in left field. Nearly 3 years later, on the evening of July 18, 1989, Moore shot his wife and then turned the gun on himself. He apparently never got over that one pitch to Henderson. The guy was just not the same after that, said Brian Dowling, a teammate. All you ever heard about, all you ever read about, was one pitch. His agent, Dave Pinter, was even more bitter. That home run killed him, he said.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.